Hello, welcome to Kids History Club today. Today we're going to learn about who the Puritans were, so stay tuned. So in order to understand about who the Puritans were, first we need to understand what the Reformation was. So basically during the Middle Ages, the church that was the only accepted church in Western Europe was the Roman Catholic Church. There were no Baptist churches, Presbyterian churches, or any other church other than the Roman Catholic Church. That meant it had a monopoly on church power. Monopoly is when control is limited to just one group or one individual, in this case, the one church being the Catholic Church. So with this power, it wasn't just religious, it was also political. So a lot of times people will ask the question, does absolute power corrupt? And there's a phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there was a corruption of power in the Catholic Church at this time. Some of the claims of abuse and issues that were coming up was that clergy were having families in spite of the church's rules against it. Also, the clergy were gaining wealth despite the fact that there was a lot of poverty going on at this time. There were also issues regarding equality and education and access to the Bible. At the time, the Bible was only written in Latin. So if you only spoke English or German or French, you didn't have access to the Bible. And most common people didn't speak Latin. They would speak the language of their country. Also at issue was the sale of indulgences. So indulgences were basically get into heaven tickets. It was like if you felt that you had sinned, messed up, and you needed a way to get into heaven and forgiveness for your sins, or forgiveness for someone else, say your loved one passed away and they had sins they didn't confess, you would pay a priest or someone selling indulgences to get that indulgence. And that would sort of function out as a get into heaven free card. There were also doctrinal differences that were beginning to come about, and we're going to talk a little bit about those in a minute. So someone who came about before the Reformation was John Wycliffe. He was born around 1330 and he died in 1384. He was a well-educated man. He went to Oxford, which is the great university in England. So among his teachings, which were viewed by the Catholic Church as heretical, going against what should be taught, he believed that the Roman Catholic Church had become too corrupt and sinful, and they should give up their worldly wealth to help the poor. His followers were called lawlords. That was the term used for them. Pope Gregory XI, who was Pope at the time, called for John Wycliffe's arrest, but he was protected by an English prince at the time named John of Gaunt. Wycliffe's writings were banned by the church, and also Wycliffe believed that the Bible should be read by everyone, not just by people who speak Latin. So he started translating the Bible into English. Eventually, a man named William Tyndale would finish the translation for him after Wycliffe's death. So now we're getting to the part where the Reformation really gets started, and that's with Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther believed in justification by faith alone and not by works. In other words, he believed that if people got saved and got into heaven, it was due only because they believed in Jesus and his work rather than what good works they could do. Luther also believed in grace alone, meaning that this salvation was a gift from God and that it came directly from God and not as the result of the church. He believed in Scripture alone, that all teaching in Christianity should come directly from the Bible. Martin Luther believed that the sale of indulgences had become corrupt, and he would eventually reject the sale of indulgences. On October 31st, 1517, he nailed up 95 theses explaining his points to a church door in Wittenberg. That's considered the start of the Reformation, even though, as we know about Wycliffe, things had been happening for a while. The Protestants eventually separated from the Catholics. So Luther at first wanted to reform the church, which is why it's called the Reformation. But as time went on, reform got harder and harder to do, and a complete split happened. And then the Protestants started to split into denominations. So that's how we get Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, all the different denominations of Christians. John Calvin came along later, and he believed strongly in the concept of grace alone and in the concept of predestination that Wycliffe had talked about. He would influence the Puritans' thought. So now let's go to the Reformation in England. It started with this man, King Henry VIII. So King Henry VIII became heir to the throne when his older brother, Prince Arthur, died. But since at the time most marriages for kings and queens were about making alliances with other kings and queens in their kingdoms, he married Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish princess and the widow of his brother Arthur. So at the time, it was expected that kings would have a son to take their place on the throne after they died. They didn't want their daughters to take their place on the throne. And King Henry's marriage to Catherine didn't produce any sons, only a daughter named Mary. So King Henry wanted a son, and his wife was getting too old to have any more kids. So he decided that his marriage should be declared a sin due to the fact that he had married his brother's widow. The Pope at the time, however, refused to grant him an annulment. An annulment is like a divorce, except it's like saying that the marriage doesn't count at all. Once the Pope refused to grant Henry an annulment, he knew what was taking place with Martin Luther, and he decided that he should take England out of Roman Catholicism altogether, like people in Germany were doing. After he took England out of Roman Catholicism and started the Church of England, in which Henry himself was the head of the church, he got his annulment and married Anne Boleyn. They had another daughter named Elizabeth. Anne Boleyn was beheaded for adultery, and he married Jane Seymour and finally had his son named Edward. Now, after Henry died and his kids took over, Edward VI had a peaceful reign during which Protestantism advanced. But it was a very short reign because Edward was very sick, and he died at a very young age, around 15 or 16. He was only king for about 6 years, and then Mary I took over, and she loved Catholicism. She had married a Catholic husband who was the Spanish king, and during her time as the ruler, Protestants were persecuted, and some of them fled to Switzerland, which was where John Calvin was from. And Calvin's influence began to rub off on these people who were Protestants from England who had fled there. And once Elizabeth I restored the Church of England, and some of the Protestants started coming back, they spread that influence. But Catholic influence also remained very strong during Elizabeth's reign. So the Church of England was a lot like the Catholic Church in many ways. Remember, Henry didn't separate due to ideological grounds. He separated because he wanted his annulment. So the Puritans in England wanted to get rid of any Catholic influence in the Church of England. In other words, they wanted to purify it. That's where we get the term Puritans from. They wanted the Church of England to be completely Protestant, no Catholic influence whatsoever. And some wanted to do this while remaining part of the Church of England. So in other words, they would stay part of the Church of England, get rid of the Catholic influence in it, make it entirely Protestant, but not break away from it, still be part of that church. But some did want to break away. They thought the Church of England has too much Catholic influence to reform it, so instead of trying to change it, we'll just go away from it altogether. After Elizabeth I died, James I became the new king. So the Puritans thought that they could make some gains with James I. He had been raised in Scotland instead of England, and so they thought he would have the same loyalty to the Church of England that Elizabeth I had had. So they tried to influence James I at the Hampton Court Conference. Unfortunately for the Puritans, James I didn't like any of their ideas except for one. Can you guess which one it was? If you guess that it's the idea that the Bible should be translated into English, you're right. That's where the idea of the King James Bible came from. The translation of the King James Bible didn't happen there, but that's what set the wheels in motion to make it happen. And they actually were influenced by Wycliffe and Tyndale in that. The Puritans made gains among merchants and lawyers, so middle-class type of people, usually not the firstborn sons in the society of the time, but people that did have some money and did have some influence. The Puritans started to have an increasing influence in academia, so the universities, the colleges, the schools, they started to have an influence there, and in Parliament, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a little bit. Basically, Parliament is like Congress, but the British version of that. There was still some persecution that was happening to the Puritans at this time, and this picture is actually from a book called John Fox's Book of Martyrs. It was a popular book among the Puritans at the time that told about Protestant persecution by the Catholics. So since it's Thanksgiving, let's take a little bit of time to learn about the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were one small group of Puritans, and they were part of the Puritan movement that sought to separate from the Church of England altogether. And that's what their congregation was called, the English Separatist Church. They left England for Holland, which is across the English Channel, in around 1607 or 1608. In 1620, after spending a little bit of time in Holland, they began to become concerned that their kids were not going to learn about their English way of life and their English background. So in 1620, they went to Plymouth, England, and got financial backing from a London stock company. So there were people that wanted to make some money off of this. And they sailed on a ship called the Mayflower to the Americas. There was a lot of hardship when they got there, and about half of them died of disease or starvation during that first winter. They landed in the winter of 1620. Fortunately for them, that spring they met a native named Samoset who introduced them to another native named Squanto. Squanto had been sold into slavery in Europe and actually learned how to speak English while there before making his way back to the Americas, only to find that his tribe, the Pawtuxet tribe, had died out of disease. A lot of diseases spread from Europeans to natives at that time. So Squanto was adopted into the Wampanoag tribe under their chief Massasoit. William Bradford was the governor of the Pilgrims, and he appointed Edward Winslow to be the ambassador to the native people. And so Squanto, Edward Winslow, William Bradford, and Massasoit formed an alliance between the two, and Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to do things like plant corn and catch fish. So the Pilgrims planted their crops during the spring of 1621. They grew during that summer, and as fall came, they made a giant harvest and invited the natives to come over. Edward Winslow wrote that the Pilgrims had gone fowling, so they had been hunting for birds, and that's where the tradition of turkey comes from, and that the natives brought in some deer meat, and they had a giant feast, which is recognized as the first Thanksgiving. So let's learn a little bit more about the Puritans in America. So like I said, the Pilgrims were of the Puritan faith, but there were a lot more Puritans left in England. They were just one little group. And the Pilgrims made their journey in 1620. 10 years later, in 1630, a lot more Puritans set off for the Massachusetts area, and they founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Later, they would merge with Plymouth Colony to create Massachusetts, but at the time they were separate colonies. And this second wave of Puritan settlers was much bigger. They were led by John Winthrop, who got the charter to start the colony, and he said that the colony should be a city upon a hill, which was his way of saying it should be a good example to the whole world. The things the Puritans founded when they were there include the city of Boston and Harvard University. And Puritan culture emphasized hard work and thrift, so saving your money, spending it wisely. They were known for being very strict religiously, and that's why they kicked out Roger Williams, because they viewed him as too open and accepting of views that differed from theirs, and he went on to found the colony of Rhode Island. The Quaker movement had spun off from the Puritan movement back in England, and one of those Quakers named William Penn started his own colony in Pennsylvania. And you might see a picture of William Penn with your breakfast in the morning. So now let's talk a little bit about the Puritans' legacy, what they left behind and how we remember them today. So yes, they were very strict religiously. They believed that you should stick to what you believe in, but they also helped to promote equality. They believed that all the members of the church were just as important as the leaders of the church. They fought against the church corruption in the Church of England, just like the earlier Protestants had done with the Roman Catholic Church. They also fought against royal tyranny. They didn't believe you just had to go along with what the king said just because he was the king. They believed the king could be wrong too. They argued for freedom of speech and religion, which had an impact on our country's history. So those were ideas expressed by the Puritan Peter Wentworth as far back as 1576. Also, the idea of the American dream, that you work hard to get ahead, and you work hard for what you have, and you behave responsibly to get it, that comes from their idea of thrift and working hard and being industrious. And we get the idea of celebrating Thanksgiving from them. So we should all be thankful for the Puritans when we sat down to eat our turkey at our Thanksgiving dinner this year. That was Kids History Club for today. Thank you for joining me. Have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.